And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 64, we're joined by Brittany Citron. Brittany's the founder of a company called PROnatal Fitness. And in amongst working with the general population on their fitness goals and outcomes during the pregnancy period, they are primarily a fitness professional education provider focusing specifically on the pre and postnatal period. And this is a period of time that most fitness professionals have a significant amount of consternation around, particularly in the pre-pregnancy period leading up to the birth of the child. Many fitness professionals, as Brittany will talk about during the episode, are afraid or, at the very least reticent to work with this population. She'll even talk a little bit about her own experience in pregnancy and really how that was a catalyzing event to help her want to educate fitness professionals on how to assist women who are pregnant, or postpartum, get back to their normal activities of daily living. And the thing that I love that she talks about is preparing for pregnancy as an event. And I liken it to periodizing pregnancy almost, for those of you that are familiar with the periodization concept. I think all of you are going to find this conversation to be very fascinating. I also think you're going to find it presents a great business opportunity because, as Brittany mentioned, there's a large swath of the population that is either going to be pregnant or has been pregnant. So this is not only a great business opportunity, but also a great way for us to, again, elevate onto the healthcare continuum on a very important part of someone's life journey when they're having a child. Any additional information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 64. Please enjoy this conversation with Brittany Citron. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Brittany Citron. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and go blue.
Go blue indeed. Yeah, Brittany is a fellow Wolverine, actually, an Ann Arborite transplanted to New York. So we're very happy to at least virtually bring her back into Ann Arbor for this conversation.
Yes, that's right. I still have my Michigan cell phone number, even though I think I've been in New York City for like 20 years now, but so
love it.
Can never get out of Michigan.
Yeah, you still got you still got the 734 ties.
That's right.
So I'm excited to get in this conversation because this is the first time we've really talked about this topic on the wellness paradox, which is fitness for the pre and postnatal population. But Brittany, before we dive into that specifically and your company, why don't you just give us a little bit of an idea of your background to provide some context for the discussion?
Yeah, so my background was not in fitness. It was in business. And I actually went to the University of Michigan Business School before it was Ross. So that's dating me a little bit. And then I worked in consumer packaged goods brand management for about 12 years after that. Fitness for me was a passion. It was a hobby. I was a dancer for nearly 20 years, captain of the Michigan dance team for 3 years. And once I moved out to New York City, I loved the group fitness scene and just taking advantage of all of the fitness opportunities that New York City had. But really for me, everything changed when I got pregnant for the first time. So it took me nearly 2 years of significant infertility struggles before I finally had a successful pregnancy. And so while I was beyond thrilled, of course, I was also scared to death.
Yeah.
And something in me, I felt like I've struggled so much to get to this point. I'm not going to screw this up now. And suddenly all that confidence I had and moving my body in different ways vanished. And I feared all the classes that I used to love.
Mm.
And so this is where I looked to my instructors for guidance. I was desperately seeking, like, what's safe, what's not, what should I do, what should I not, how should I modify? And mostly I got nervous smiles and comments like, well, just do what you can, or listen to your body, or my personal favorite, just be careful. To which I would reply, thank you so much. That's very helpful. And then for most of class, I was ignored. And I distinctly remember at the time feeling so frustrated and angry, thinking my instructors were ignoring me. And of course, now having worked with so many health and fitness professionals, I know they weren't ignoring me.
Right.
They were scared to death, right? Because as nervous as I was about potential, what to do, what not to do, they were even more nervous about saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So instead, they chose not to say anything at all, which wasn't good for anyone. So I ended up stopping a lot of my group fitness classes because I was just too nervous, which for a lot of those studios and gyms, that was money left on the table.
Yeah.
And I did the best I could with the information I had at the time. I had some minor issues, but I had a few friends at the time who were pregnant with me who had much more significant issues. One of my friends was just too nervous, and she actually stopped exercising altogether and had a lot of issues with her pregnancy, a lot of pains and injuries and significant complications with labor. I had another friend that pushed herself too much, had issues from that. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me, because I was like, here's this population of people that are so motivated to do the right thing, so motivated to stay fit. But when you don't have the appropriate guidance or resources, it's a big barrier. And in this industry, we talk so much about the large portion of the population, getting them into fitness, and how do we motivate them? And like, no, here's a population that you don't need to motivate. They're ready. They're desperately seeking guidance, and they're not getting it. And so this was really a turning point for me. I started doing more research in this space, and I actually pursued my fitness education. But it wasn't until I met the woman who today is our director of education, Carolyn Appel, Mike, which you met as well, and that I really knew we had something. And so Carolyn was a veteran in the fitness industry, background in exercise science, master's in motor learning and control, spent years as a fitness industry educator. And she too had just come out of, she had had her first child and experienced the same lack of evidence-based information. So what she did is she actually used her background as she was a competitive tennis player. Mm-hmm. And so she used the approach of, from her athletic background, of training for the specific demands of the event. So in other words, looking at the goals and looking at the stresses placed on the body and actually preparing her body for the stresses of the journey. So training for it like it was an athletic event. And she had a very successful pregnancy, birth, and an easy recovery. And learning that approach was it was game changing for me, because I was like, oh my God, I spent so much time and stress and energy focusing on what to avoid. And I wasn't even thinking about how to prepare my body for such an event. So we decided to combine, we had very complementary skills, and we decided to kind of combine our skills to focus on building a business we both felt really needed to exist. So a few years later, PROnatal Fitness was born. Pardon the pun. So that's kind of the long story, a little bit short, not really short.
Yeah, no, and I love that story. And I think that the genesis of it all is, the pain that you felt of not being able to do something that was really important to you, and the realization that many other women were feeling that same pain. And so this was stories that are birthed, again, no pun intended, out of personal necessity, I think, are sometimes some of the most compelling business stories. And the one thing I do want to point out to a lot of the fitness professionals that are listening is, a number of you are probably disproportionately male, because our industry is disproportionately male. So this also kind of brings up a little bit of a point of empathy and awareness around what pregnant women who are exercisers go through. So I love the story. And I mentioned it to you when we first met at URSA, that effectively you guys are talking about periodizing pregnancy, which I think is a very, very neat and fun concept. And that's kind of what we're going to dive into a little bit more in the conversation. And where you left us is where I want you to pick back up, which is, tell us a little bit more about PROnatal Fitness. I think we have an idea of what it does, but give us an idea of its mission. Who does it serve, and what is it all about?
So our mission is to help as many people as possible successfully train for the event of a lifetime, so they can focus more on enjoying the thrill of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So this journey through pregnancy, childbirth, and into parenthood is truly, it's the event of a lifetime, physically and of course mentally and emotionally. And as any parent can tell you, myself included, my kids are almost 10 and 6. It goes by too fast.
Sure.
And we want people to enjoy this time. We want them to have the energy to play with their kids, to move, to do things, to care for one kid while, taking care of the baby, etc. And we don't want them to be bogged down in pain. And so it's really about kind of having the strength and preparing for this journey so you can enjoy it. And in terms of who we serve 2 populations. So those who are pregnant and postpartum. And for them, we have our training programs that they can do on our app. We have virtual training as well. But really our primary audience is the health and fitness professional, because that is where we feel we can make the biggest impact. Our vision is for one day pregnant people can walk into any class they want and feel confident knowing their instructor is prepared to guide them. They can easily find a qualified personal trainer if that's what they want. Or they can go online and find their favorite pregnancy fitness class or whatever, and know that that is quality, safe, and effective programming. So that's why for professionals, we know they have different learning needs when it comes to this population. Some people, like a personal trainer, want to specialize in being able to train that population. So for them, we have a very in-depth specialist course. Some people, like those instructors that were in my class, maybe they don't want to specialize, but they certainly want to be able to better coach and provide modifications, et cetera. So for them, we have a very different course specific to group fitness. So really that is kind of where our passion is many health, the more health and fitness professionals that we can educate, the bigger the impact we can make.
Yeah. And I think that's not only is it an admirable vision that you have, but I think it's a very necessary vision for our industry, because, there definitely is a gap in what I would call the translatable evidence to practice of working, with the pregnant and the postpartum population. In a lot of cases, we talked about this when we first, met at URSA, is that you just don't get IRB approval in many cases to do any type of aggressive intervention with a pregnant woman. So I think, giving practitioners the skills and the tools that they need to be effective working with this population, I think is so important. And I just want you to touch on this before we dive a little deeper. Talk about the business opportunity that exists here for fitness professionals, because this is a large underserved market that we're talking about here.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the myths about working with this population, is people think, oh, it's too small.
Yeah.
Oh, it's very niche. I don't need to focus. I don't have any pregnant members right now or whatnot. I don't need to focus on that. So first of all, there are more and more people, millions of babies are born each year. In fact, I think in 2018, there was a study that said women who were ending their childbearing years, about 86% of them had children. That was up 7.5% from 2006. But beyond that, you don't need a statistic for this. More and more are becoming active during pregnancy. And you can see this by looking around the gym, by looking in classes. A lot of, fitness owners or instructors will come up to us and say, I don't know, is something in the water? Like, everyone's pregnant now. And even though we did take a dip during the pandemic, it is coming back now. So you have more and more people exercising during pregnancy. But the other thing is, I think we have to broaden our definition of what pre and postnatal is. So if you work with female clients who have had children at any point, you work with the pre and postnatal population, because a lot of the stresses and demands that are placed on the body and everything, if those issues, childbirth and pregnancy, they certainly take a toll on the body, right? And a lot of times, if proper recovery work hasn't been done, those issues can linger years and years afterwards. So once postpartum, always postpartum.
Yep.
And the other thing that's important when working with this population, so many of the principles that are important for working with this population happen to be beneficial for everyone, for all populations. So people will come out of learning this education, they'll say, this has made me a better trainer. That I have things I'm going to apply to my seniors. I have skills that I'm going to apply for my athletes. One CrossFit trainer told us that taking our course completely changed the way she trained herself. So I think it's a much bigger population. And the final thing I will say, after personal experience with this and being in all the mommy groups, is we are willing to pay a premium for expertise in this space, especially because it was so hard to find.
Yeah, I mean, it's such good points. And I think the thing you said that is most important to highlight is that pretty much if you're working with a woman, there's a high likelihood that she is, pre or postnatal. I mean, you have people in their childbearing years, that's the prenatal population. And then the 86% of women that you said earlier who have just gotten out of their childbearing years have had a child. So I mean, this is a massive marketplace. And it's interesting when you say that people are wondering, hey, is there something in the water? Like, what's going on? I think over time there has been this general softening of the medical community's understanding of exercise and pregnancy. I mean, years ago it was say, hey, just rest, don't do anything too strenuous. To your point earlier that an instructor said to you, just be careful. Now we're realizing that was the most counterproductive advice that we could possibly give women. So our knowledge and more our applied practice has really expanded over time. And the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they have helped to move that forward in terms of some of their guidelines.
It's an excellent point. I was just going to say that. I mean, ACOG published their very first set of guidelines in 1985, when almost no research existed about exercise during pregnancy. So it was written from this first do no harm perspective. And over the years, their guidelines have evolved significantly. Their latest guidelines were from 2020 and had the strongest push for physical activity to date, just because of how much research there is now on the critical importance of physical activity, both for parent and child. I mean, some of the research that's been done shows long-term benefits to the child in terms of brain development, cardiovascular fitness, etc. So it is really becoming critical. And one of the issues we deal with is because those first set of guidelines were developed in 1985, and everyone in the medical community, everyone was craving them. And I'm telling you, ACOG must have had the best marketers at the time because those guidelines were so widely published. Challenge is a lot of people haven't seen all of the iterations and the significant evolution that has come since then. So we still have some medical providers, because again, it's not their areas of expertise, looking at guidelines or espousing guidelines from those 1985 guidelines. So to your point, it is evolved significantly over the past few decades.
Yeah. And before we dive a little bit deeper, I did want to bring up one additional point because I think it's important, and I'd like to hear you speak to it from your experience. I feel like pregnancy is a critical inflection point for most women on their physical activity and exercise journey. I feel like some women will look at it as a motivating event, like they need to be fit and healthy for their new child. I feel like other women will look at it as a barrier. And so whereas that first woman might say, you know what, I'm going to double down and I'm going to try to figure out a way to do this. Another woman might say, and justifiably so, said as a man with no kids, realizing that I don't have time for this right now. Like, this is crazy. So I feel like it's that critical inflection point for a lot of women. And, what's your view on capturing them at that point and ensuring they are on a physical active journey the rest of their life?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And we have kind of the three different groups. We have the super motivated, we have the ones that are too nervous, and then we have the ones that are so tired, and like that first trimester when you're dealing with the nausea and the fatigue, etc. So for that population that are just like, I'm too tired, etc., it's a lot of, ironically, movement is one of the things that can help with the nausea and fatigue. So we try to have smaller goals and get people moving in any way they can. And the other important thing that we tried to, for the people that are scared or nervous, we've kind of focused on these principles of, we're preparing your body for the events ahead. So it's interesting. We over the years, there's been this guidance to stop this, avoid that, don't lift weights, etc. And this guidance is given with the intention of mitigating pain or injury. And ironically, it can be the very thing that leads to it, because the body's not prepared to manage those stresses. So our focus is on kind of preparing your body so that you don't get injured and do all these things. In fact, one fun thing that we do with a lot of clients, it's very important, they like doing it, is we do a lot of ADL practice for the activities of daily living as a new parent. Because when you think about it, in that early postpartum period, your body is trying to recover from a major trauma, plus the 9 months of pregnancy stresses. And by the way, you're not allowed to sleep. And you're forced into these 24/7 demands of, squatting, bending, pushing, pulling, getting up and down from the ground, lifting and carrying and carrying and carrying. And so we want to make sure that proper movement mechanics have been ingrained, because the goal is to be able to perform all those activities with maximum efficiency and minimal stress to the body so that you can recover. So a lot of the movements we train, and starting in pregnancy, are things like the crib reach, the bath time kneel, the baby lift, the ground get up, the ground pick up, etc. So that by the time they get to that postpartum period, their body kind of knows how to move with proper mechanics, and it's less stressful on the body.
Yeah, I love that. I love this concept of training for the event. I think that is such a neat perspective to take on this, because it kind of it allows it to take on this whole new positive life of its own. And as we kind of continue through this discussion, you mentioned one of the myths and misconceptions earlier, which is the business one, like, hey, that this isn't a population that I really need to be concerned with working with. Are there any other myths or misconceptions that really stick out to you with this?
Well, I think yes. And I think the other one that we just talked about is the idea that training this population is all about knowing what to avoid, right? If I know those things, then I'm good. And that is certainly an important piece of it. There are things that you need to avoid or regress, but I always like to give the analogy that if you wanted to train for your very first marathon, would your first objective be, let me think about all the things I should stop doing to stay safe prior to that marathon? No, you would think about how to begin preparing your body for those stresses so that you're able to successfully complete it with minimal risk of pain or injury, and maybe, just maybe, actually enjoy a little bit of such a Herculean event. So that is our approach, because the stresses placed on the body, my goodness, throughout pregnancy and childbirth and early parenthood are certainly comparable, and they are specific. But I would say one other barrier, and this was a big barrier for those instructors that were working with me as well, is I think there's been this thinking, like, if you ask any, and I'm speaking a lot to group fitness here, because if you ask a lot of instructors, do you want to be able to better guide those pregnant and new parents that are coming into your class? They'd say, yes, absolutely. Do you want to spend several $100s and take a 30+ hour course to do that and come away with it with a lot of information that's not relevant for your job? I mean, most people are going to say, no, I'm not, I don't have that kind of time and money to spend on a course that may not be applicable for my work.
Yeah.
And so that's why it was important for us to kind of break down that barrier and say, no, here is a course education completely tailored to your needs. It's short, it's sweet, and all of these strategies can be implemented in group fitness. So we don't want people to feel like just because, they don't want to specialize and make that time and investment that they can't learn anything at all, right? There are different needs when it comes to this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's incumbent upon you as a professional to at least have a cursory understanding of all the populations that you may need to work with. I mean, as a group exercise instructor or personal trainer, you are a generalist to a great extent. You are working with the people that, walk through those doors. And if there's a pregnant woman in there, you're professionally responsible and obligated to make sure that you can at least appropriately accommodate her. Yes, we're not talking about working with the high risk pregnancy population or something like that, but I couldn't agree more. I did want to go back to something you said earlier, because it struck me, and I kind of, I laughed a little bit internally. And I really try to be delicate in this conversation as a man who has never and will never have a child. I always feel like I once gave a lecture on menopause, and I felt like I was the least qualified person in the room.
Really?
Giving a lecture on exercise and menopause. This is another one of those conversations that make me very uncomfortable, because if you're a woman and you're listening to this and you're saying, dude, what could you possibly know about pregnancy? I completely agree with you. But the statement that I did want to make was, what you talked about in terms of, you wouldn't go into training for a marathon by saying, hey, what can I not do? And then you talked about the kind of the stress of pregnancy. And the thing that kind of made me giggle a little inside is, I've been training people for 23 years now. I can't imagine anything I would do to anyone in the gym that would be as remotely strenuous as pregnancy and childbirth. It's just kind of like, when you put it in that context, it's kind of ironic that we're so apprehensive and we're so cautious when, to your point, you're basically preparing for arguably the biggest positive trauma the human body can ever undergo.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, one fun thing we used to do when we did some live trainings is we'd get a lot of guys. It was usually 50-50 in terms of male and female who would come to our workshops. We'd make them all put backpacks on their front, and then we'd load them with kettlebells and, to be about 25, 30 pounds. And we'd make them go down, tie your shoe, lay down on the ground. Now try to get up. It's your third time you had to pee tonight, and we do all these things. And oh my God, the guys would all be complaining, my back hurts. Oh my God. And so, yes, it's a stressful event.
Yeah. And
worth it.
Yeah, worth it. But again, like any hard, stressful event, the more you prepare, what is it? Failing to plan is planning to fail kind of thing.
Yes,
if you actually prepare for it. So let's get into this. I mean, look, you have some amazing courses and some amazing opportunities for fitness professionals to take advantage of, and we'll talk about those and link up to those in the show notes page. But there are people that are listening now, and they say, okay, well, what are some best practices, or what are some things that I should consider? Maybe what are the things I want to be cautious of? Because first, I do want to do no harm. So kind of give us an idea of the best practice landscape here.
Yeah, so let me give you a few principles from, like you said, we have a kind of periodization approach where pregnancy is kind of going through the foundation strength and birth prep phases. Postpartum is foundation strength performance. But a few important principles that we focus on, especially in that foundation stage. One is neutral alignment. And as a health and fitness professional, most of you should be aware of this, but it's so important in helping people understand what that is and find it in their own body and learn to move in neutral, because pregnancy tends to pull the body out of neutral alignment, which is going to increase the stress on the soft tissues, et cetera. So we really want to train that. The other big thing that we say is the single most important thing you can do is to focus on that deep core activation. And so we focus a lot in the foundation stage on proper breathing mechanics. And this is probably one of the most eye-opening things for a lot of professionals, because they learn the importance of breathing and how it literally impacts every system in the body. And when you're pregnant, it's actually impacting the fetal growth environment. So we do a lot of practice on what we call 360 breathing, learning to breathe with that 360-degree rib cage expansion, et cetera. So that is a big focus. And then, as I mentioned already, we're training movement mechanics and not just fundamental movement patterns, but also those ADLs, right? And so those are just a few principles. Another fun thing we do is instead of HIIT, we do LIT, labor intensity interval training, to prepare for stage 1 labor, which is Mother Nature's ultimate interval training, let me tell you. So it's our way of physically and mentally preparing for those intervals of stage 1 labor. So those are just a few things. Some of the things to regress or avoid, the thing we have to be, one of the biggest things that we have to be mindful of is a growing belly is increasing intra-abdominal pressure. And so that is why a certain degree of diastasis recti, that's the widening of the gap between the left and right sides of the rectus abdominis muscle, a certain degree of that is natural. The body is supposed to do that during pregnancy. However, there are activities or behaviors that when done could exacerbate DR and make it become more problematic. So a lot of traditional core work as the belly grows does need to be regressed or avoided. Other behaviors, like, and this is an interesting one, breath holding upon exertion spikes the pressure in the core. That's why a lot of people lifting very heavy loads will use the Valsalva maneuver, right? That breath holding, because it's spiking the pressure in the core, which allows you to generate more force, but it's placing excessive amount of pressure on the abdominal wall and the pelvic floor. And interestingly, that's why we do see diastasis and pelvic floor issues. And a lot of power lifters are just those lifting heavy weights as well. So that is something to be mindful of. The other thing we have to be mindful of is a lot of hormonal changes going on in the body. One of them, particularly relaxin, which is providing some added mobility to allow the body to accommodate a growing baby, and providing some added mobility for birth, which is very important. But it can also lead to an increase in your mobility and a decrease in your stability, right? So now all of a sudden we have this greater range of motion, but we don't necessarily have control over that range of motion. And it impacts everyone differently, but that is something that we have to be mindful of as well. So those are just a few examples.
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you a little something about one of our sponsors. As all of you are well aware, addressing the wellness paradox is a lifelong passion project for me. And when you're going to go on a long journey, it's difficult to go it alone. You need to find like-minded individuals that are willing to go on that crusade with you. And that's exactly what I found at the MRF Institute. The team over at the MRF Institute creates educational content for fitness and wellness professionals who are serious about becoming a part of our healthcare continuum. Getting on the healthcare continuum is all about leveling up our skills to be looked at as that valued resource provider. The wellness paradox is certainly an avenue for you to do that, but we need many different levers to pull if we're going to get there. And the MRF Institute is definitely one of those levers. You can go to their website, mrfinstitute.org, to find all kinds of great, informative, free informational content. And if you choose to engage with any of their paid content, they've created a coupon code specifically for Wellness Paradox listeners. You can enter in WP 2022, that's WP, and then the number 2022 to the website at checkout to receive a 15% discount on your purchase. I highly recommend you go check out mrfinstitute.org. Now back to today's episode. No, that's great. And you're very helpful to have those general principles. And again, it's much more nuanced than that. Obviously, each person also is going to respond a little differently.
Yes.
One thing, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention is that thermal stress in a pregnant woman is generally something to be cautious of. Doing a hot yoga class between, your point to the, relaxin and, being in, 95 degrees and 95% humidity, probably not the wisest thing for a pregnant woman to do.
Exactly. And that's an important one because, the pregnant body is amazing, right? It's amazing. And to your point, there could be a risk, especially in the earlier part of pregnancy, that first part of the first trimester, when that critical brain and organ development is occurring. If the maternal body temperature elevates beyond 102 degrees Fahrenheit, there could be complications. But that's why the pregnant body is so cool. It has these adaptations to cool itself off. So you start sweating at a lower threshold when you're pregnant. You just dissipate more heat through your skin, through your respiration. However, we have to avoid those conditions that make it more difficult to dissipate heat. So exactly to your point, the hot yoga, the exercise in high heat humidity, the saunas, the hot tubs, etc. We have to avoid those conditions. But a lot of people think, oh, wait, exercise, that elevates body temperature. But exercise alone, even high intensity, has never shown to be an issue because of those adaptations that the pregnant body has.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable when you just think physiologically about the whole childbearing process. It's mind numbing. And, I tell people all the time with regard to exercise and pregnancy, what happened when we were largely a hunter gatherer society? There were women that were doing very, very intensive exercises then, and clearly it worked because on an evolutionary level, like we're still all here. And so I think it's when you think of it through both lenses, it is a fascinating thing. One of my anatomy professors in undergrad at Michigan was a fetal and developmental anatomist. And so I probably know an abnormal amount about fetal development for an exercise physiologist.
Oh, well.
But it is so fascinating what the human body is actually capable of. And I think, pregnancy is a progressive event, I would say, right? It's you don't go from not pregnant to big baby belly in like a week. And training is very much the same way. It's hey, you could start somebody out at a reasonable point, and as long as you're paying attention to how their body responds, you can progress them appropriately to prepare for this event.
Yes, and can I tell you one other fun fact about just the amazing adaptations is that your cardiac output actually increases during pregnancy. So you're pumping more blood with each heartbeat, and your heart is pumping more times per minute. So the body is essentially doing naturally what a lot of athletes might take illegal performance enhancing drugs to achieve.
Yes.
So there have even been studies that show that some pregnant athletes have achieved personal records during this period because of that effect. Now, of course, we have other mitigating factors like the changes during third trimester, the added weight gain, and then you've got the nausea and fatigue in first trimester. But it's just an interesting note about the body that we have this increased aerobic capacity, especially in the second trimester. Right?
Which I think is a super important point. And I mean, this speaks to one of the early concerns about exercise in pregnancy, that somehow that exercise would be, in air quotes, stealing blood or oxygen supply away from the developing fetus. That's actually not the case, because the body responds by expanding that capacity, which again, like
exactly.
The threshold,
good stress.
Yeah,
yes.
It's just fascinating how life knows kind of how to carry on just on a biological level.
It's like that's what we stress our muscles so that they grow stronger and that they're able to lift heavier things, etc. So when you're exercising, the placenta has to fight a little harder for the oxygen and nutrients, but that's what helps it grow bigger and stronger and be better able to nourish the growing fetus with oxygen and nutrients through all the other hours of the day. So that is really needed. Yeah,
it's fascinating. And there's the scientist in me wants to keep going down that rabbit hole, but we don't have that much time. Before we start to bring this to a close, the one question that I do need to ask, because you hear the words used a lot, and I think it's important for you to speak to this to our audience. You often hear high risk pregnancy. And I realize that that's a very broad term, because it could mean, hey, you're over the age of 32 or whatever they deem as the cutoff point, or
35. I think I was what they call a geriatric pregnancy or advanced maternal age.
Dear. I feel like you should never tell a pregnant woman that she's a geriatric pregnancy.
Even if
you're in your 70s, you shouldn't say that. So you hear this term thrown around a lot, and I feel like as a fitness professional who maybe isn't very comfortable working with this population, you hear high risk pregnancy for whatever reason that someone has been told they're high risk. And you immediately want to say, oh, this seems dangerous. So how should fitness professionals think about that term when they hear it? From your perspective, what does it mean, and what should we take into consideration?
So we actually published a very interesting piece on this because, first of all, to your point, there are certain contraindications for which exercise, especially impact exercise, may not be permissible or might need significant modifications. However, a lot of the contraindications are actually being reevaluated now because they were actually based on expert opinion and not empirical evidence. And so one thing in particular is bed rest. So in North America, bed rest is prescribed by about 87% of medical professionals in high risk cases in the absence of just having any other alternative. And there is not one study to date that has shown that actually that leads to improved pregnancy outcomes. And there are multiple studies documenting the negative effects of prolonged activity restriction. So right now, there are a lot of researchers actually recommending a reclassification. So moving some absolute contraindications, which is exercise is not permissible, to relative, where just certain modifications or restrictions are needed. And then with regards to bed rest, there is a push to at least be able to participate in your activities of daily living. So at least move around, etc. Don't be in bed. So this is just something that is happening right now. And we published a piece just to show what is being reevaluated. And so I think the key takeaway from that is we need to ask questions. So as a fitness professional working with a client who comes to you and tells you, you know, my doctor has told me I need to go on bed rest, or my doctor has told me I need to do this. It's very important for that client to go to the doctor and ask some questions, really understand a little bit more, and if needed, get a second opinion. Of course, there are cases where something that, you know, but all we're saying now is the importance of asking questions. And so as a fitness professional, of course, you are always asking your client, what are the restrictions, etc., from your doctor, and you know, making sure you're adhering to them. But we also want to encourage our clients to be advocates and ask questions themselves.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And it is encouraging to hear that bed rest is something that's being reconsidered, because, you know, by and large, bed rest never seems like it is a good thing for a human being, with the full understanding that there are some cases where it absolutely is warranted.
Yeah.
So, Brittany, where can people go if they want to find out more about PROnatal Fitness?
So you can go to our website, PROnatalFitness.com, and when you get there, you'll see a section on Fit Pro education. So you can see all the courses and the guides. And the other thing, if you want a great free resource, is you can go to PROnatalFitness.com/FitPro, FITPRO. That's going to give you a document, the 5 pregnancy changes every health and fitness professional should know. So that's some of the stuff we talked about today, but understanding the stresses placed on the body and the implications for you as a professional working with these clients in any capacity. So that's PROnatalFitness.com/FitPro. And you can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at PROnatal Fitness.
Very cool. And I will link up to all of that in the show notes page, so everyone has a chance to access that easily. Before I let you go, I want to end the podcast with the question that I asked to all of our guests as we bring it to a close. And it's my thesis behind the wellness paradox is that there's this gap that exists between fitness professionals and the medical community. And I always am curious to ask our guests, what is the one piece of advice that they could give fitness professionals to close that gap off with? What would you say?
Probably something you hear a lot, the importance of communication. And, you know, especially when working with this population, the medical professional and the fitness professional both have important expertise, but we have different expertise. But we're always told, clients are always told, ask your doctor for any guidance on exercise. You know, the doctor is out, but doctors will tell us, it was like a paragraph in our med school training or nothing at all. And they have a lot of expertise, but that is not one of them. And so a lot of times they're giving outdated guidance or something that doesn't make sense. So the first thing we encourage clients to ask questions to their doctors. And when they're not getting answers or they don't want to do that, we always say, ask permission for your client to contact the doctor. And when you contact the medical professional, you're seeking to understand, right? You want to understand the rationale behind some of the recommendations, and you're confirming your shared goal and providing the best care, but then speaking to how you may have a different approach to achieving that goal, maybe potentially sharing some of the newer ACOG guidelines, et cetera. And a lot of times what happens is when medical professionals realize, oh, I'm talking to a competent person who knows what they're talking about, they have complete trust. Oh, whatever you say. And what's happened, a few of our trainers have told us when they've contacted a client's doctor, the doctor just starts referring them patients. And so they're like, oh, this is a great referral source for me. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's about communication.
Awesome. Brittany Citron, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you for having me, Mike. This is fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Brittany as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a massive difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 64. Please be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next week, please be well